Ford's problem in late 1968 was simple. On superspeedways, air was worth more than horsepower. Chrysler had a flush-nose Charger 500 on the way. Ford needed something faster, and they needed it before Daytona. What they built was a Torino with a stretched nose, a rear bumper welded to the front, and rocker panels rolled to cheat the ride height rules. They named it after a racetrack that had not hosted a single race yet. It won 26 races in one season, pulled Richard Petty out of a Plymouth for the only time in his career, and scared Chrysler into building something so extreme that NASCAR had to ban it. So how did Ford pull this off? It started with a problem they could not solve with a bigger engine. By the late 1960s, NASCAR had turned into a two-manufacturer war. General Motors pulled out of factory racing back in '63, which left Ford and Chrysler throwing everything they had at each other on the superspeedways. Ford had its 427 side-oiler. Chrysler had the 426 Hemi. Both were making roughly the same power, and the engine guys were running out of tricks. You can only bore and stroke a block so far before the thing shakes itself apart. So Ford's engineers started looking at the other side of the equation. Their wind tunnel testing showed that a 15% reduction in drag was worth about 5 extra miles per hour at superspeedway speed. That was the equivalent of finding 85 free horsepower without adding weight, heat, or fuel burn. The fastback Torino sports roof was aerodynamically cleaner than anything in the Chrysler stable, and David Pearson proved it by winning the 1968 Grand National Championship. The shape of the car was doing work that the engine could not do on its own. Chrysler noticed. Their first response was the Dodge Charger 500, a limited run of 69 Chargers with a flush front grille borrowed from the Coronet and a flush rear window to fix a specific problem. The standard Charger had a tunneled backlight, that recessed rear window that looked dramatic but created a pocket of turbulent air behind the car that was dragging it backward at speed. The Charger 500 sealed that up. Ford's people at Holman Moody in Charlotte knew it was coming, and they quietly started working on something that would make it irrelevant before it hit the track. Now, the man most often credited with leading that effort was Ralph Moody, co-owner of Holman Moody, and one of the sharpest racing minds Ford ever had on its side. Moody and his crew did the wind tunnel work up in Michigan, figured out what needed to change, and then brought those results down to Ford's Atlanta assembly plant in Hapeville, Georgia. Picture this. You walk into a full-scale Ford assembly plant on a Saturday morning, and there are race mechanics with welding torches taking the entire front clip off a brand new Torino right ahead of the front wheels. They graft on a new nose, roughly 5 to 6 inches longer than stock, with a sloped profile and hand-formed fender extensions. The standard Torino grille had decorative inset pockets and headlight bezels that looked fine in a showroom but were creating air pockets at speed. They replaced the whole thing with a flat, flush-mounted grille sealed to the body with a rubber gasket, smooth, tight, and almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Instead of designing a new front bumper from scratch, somebody looked at a standard Ford rear bumper and thought, that could work. They cut it, narrowed it, bent it into a slight V-shape, and filled the ends. A lip that blocks air from getting under the car and lifting the front end at speed. It reduced lift without adding drag. And then there was the last modification, which was the one that mattered most on inspection day. Moody's crew re-rolled the rocker panels, those strips of sheet metal that run along the bottom of the car between the front and rear wheels, upward by about an inch. Now, NASCAR measured ride height from the bottom of the rocker to the ground. By raising the rocker, race teams could lower the entire car an inch closer to the pavement while still passing the ruler test. Ford apparently considered calling it the Torino Warrior, which is one of those details that makes you glad someone in the room spoke up. They went with Talladega instead, after Bill France's brand new 2.66-mile superspeedway in Alabama that was still under construction and had not hosted a single event. Ford was not finished with one car either. Mercury, Ford's sister division, built its own version on the slightly larger Cyclone shell. The Mercury Cyclone Spoiler 2 used the same flush grille and rolled rockers as the Talladega, but its nose extension was even longer, roughly 19.5 inches of new sheet metal because Mercury started with a bigger front fender. Mercury offered 2 special editions, the Cale Yarborough Special in white with a red roof and the Dan Gurney Special in white with a blue roof. Gurney himself only ran 2 NASCAR Grand National races for Mercury in his entire career. Make of that what you will. Mercury claimed to have built 503 Spoiler 2s for homologation. The Cyclone spoiler registry has spent years arguing the real number was closer to 353, with about 150 standard short-nose spoilers mixed in to pad the count. If that is true, Ford and Mercury were playing the same parking lot shell game on two different assembly lines. NASCAR's 1969 rules required a manufacturer to build at least 500 examples of any special body for public sale. That is what homologation meant. Ford needed 100 cars ready before the season started. What they actually built, in a roughly 6-week window between January and February of 1969, was approximately 754 Talladegas. Every one left the factory with a 428 cubic inch Cobra Jet V8 rated at 335 horsepower, paired to a C6 3-speed automatic with a column shifter. The sticker price was about $3,570. Ford reportedly lost several $1,000s on each one. They were not trying to sell cars. They were buying a racing season. Now, the street engine and the race engine were two completely different things. On the street, the 428 Cobra Jet made plenty of torque, with period tests recording 0 to 60 in roughly 5.5 seconds and quarter miles in the mid-14s. But the race cars never used that engine. Early season Talladegas ran the venerable Ford 427 side oiler, and once NASCAR approved the new Boss 429, most factory teams switched to that. Ford had actually homologated the Boss 429 separately through the Boss 429 Mustang, so the Talladega body could be approved at the start of the season before enough of the new engines even existed. When NASCAR president Bill France came to the Atlanta plant to verify that Ford had its 500 cars, Moody said they only had about 40 finished. So he sat France down in a good viewing spot and had each car driven slowly past, then looped them around the building, so France counted the same cars 2 and 3 times. The Talladega delivered the moment it hit a racetrack. At the 1969 Daytona 500 in February, Leroy Yarbrough drove Junior Johnson's number 98 Talladega, powered by a tunnel port 427 since the Boss 429 was not yet legal. On the final lap, Yarbrough passed Charlie Glotzbach's Dodge Charger 500 to win. It was the first Daytona 500 ever decided by a last-lap pass. Yarbrough went on to win 7 races that season. For something built on weekends by guys with welding torches, that is a pretty solid debut. David Pearson, in the Holman Moody number 17 Talladega, won 11 races, took 14 poles, and posted 42 top 5 finishes from 51 starts. He took his 3rd Grand National Championship and his 2nd in a row. Talladegas and Cyclone spoilers strung together a 13-race winning streak at long-distance events. Ford swept the top 5 at Atlanta and the top 4 at Michigan. Even the Charger 500's 426 Hemi could not keep up with a Talladega running an aging 427. And then there was Richard Petty. The king of stock car racing, Plymouth's most famous driver, left Plymouth for the first and only time in his career to drive a Petty blue Ford Torino Talladega. Petty won 10 races in a Ford in '69 and finished 2nd in the championship. That is the kind of result that makes Plymouth executives very quiet in meetings. Now, while Ford was dominating the season, Bill France was finishing his new superspeedway in Alabama. The track cost about $5 million, sat on 2.66 miles of asphalt with 33-degree banking, and was barely ready when race weekend arrived in September of 1969. During practice for the first Talladega 500, things went wrong fast. Speeds were beyond anything the tire manufacturers had prepared for. Bobby Isaac qualified on pole at 196 miles per hour. Charlie Glotzbach hit 199 in a Charger Daytona engineering mule. But tires were coming apart after just a few laps. Neither Goodyear nor Firestone had compounds designed for this, and Firestone pulled out entirely. A group of drivers had formed the Professional Drivers Association in August, organized in Ann Arbor, Michigan, with Richard Petty serving as president. The PDA asked France to postpone the race until safer tires could be developed. He reportedly suggested that drivers could just run slower. Yes, really. The confrontation boiled over on Saturday night. According to Bobby Allison's account, Leroy Yarbrough threw a punch at France after France told Allison he was simply afraid to race. Whether the punch landed depends on who you ask. What is not disputed is what happened the next morning. More than 30 drivers packed their haulers and left. France ran the race anyway, padded the field with drivers from the lower Grand Touring division, threw competition cautions every 25 laps for tire changes, and offered ticket holders free admission to the next Daytona 500. Richard Brickhouse, who had resigned from the PDA the day before, won his only career Cup victory in a Dodge Charger Daytona. The PDA dissolved not long after. The 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona was Chrysler's answer, and it was not subtle. An 18-inch sheet metal nose cone with hidden pop-up headlights, a flush rear window, and a 23-inch tall rear wing mounted on pylons set at that specific height so the trunk lid could still open. Chrysler built 503 of them for homologation. Most carried the 440 Magnum, 70 got the 426 Hemi. For 1970, Plymouth went even further with the Superbird. Same aero treatment, applied to a Roadrunner shell, built specifically to bring Richard Petty back to Plymouth. And it worked. Petty came home. Pete Hamilton won the 1970 Daytona 500 in a Superbird. Buddy Baker, in a Charger Daytona, became the first driver to officially exceed 200 miles per hour on a closed course when he ran 200.447 at Talladega in March of 1970. Ford designed a successor called the Torino King Cobra, styled by Larry Shinoda. Shinoda took a completely different approach from Chrysler. Instead of bolting a massive wing and a cone nose onto existing bodywork, he shaped the entire front end into a low wedge with recessed covered headlights and a small grille opening. 3 prototypes were built with Boss 429 engines, and Cale Yarborough tested one at Daytona. All reportedly broke 200 miles per hour. But the handling was not sorted, and then everything fell apart at once. Bunky Knudsen was fired by Henry Ford II in September of '69. Lee Iacocca replaced him and immediately cut Ford's racing budget. Shinoda was shown the door. NASCAR raised the 70 homologation requirement to roughly 3,000 units. The King Cobra never had a chance. For 1971, NASCAR effectively killed every aero car in the field. Any car running the modified bodywork was restricted to engines no larger than 305 cubic inches, while standard body cars could keep running their full-size motors. Across those 2 seasons, aero cars won 73 of 102 Grand National races. For decades after, the Talladega sat in the shadow of its Mopar rivals on the collector market. And honestly, you can see why. A Hemi Charger Daytona, with its nose cone and towering wing, looks like something from a comic book. A Hemi Superbird routinely sells in the $300,000 to $500,000 range. The Talladega, by comparison, looks like a Torino that spent an afternoon at a body shop. That is starting to change. Hagerty lists a #1 condition Talladega at around $120,000. Driver quality cars still trade in the $50,000 to $85,000 range, which on a rarity-adjusted basis makes the Talladega one of the more undervalued muscle cars of the era. A barn-find presidential blue Talladega was discovered in a Tennessee field in 2022 and offered for around $25,000. A complete, original, numbers-matching Aero War car for about the price of a used pickup truck. Those kinds of finds are getting rare, but they are still out there. That pattern, a car getting too fast and the sanctioning body stepping in to slow things down, has repeated itself in stock car racing ever since. All of it traces a line back to a 6-week production run in Atlanta and the quiet conviction that air was worth more than horsepower. So what do you think? Is the Talladega the most underrated muscle car of the era, or does it deserve to stay in the shadow of the winged Mopars? Let me know in the comments.